So we're going to have to admonish our roaming Romanian brother. Take a seat. No? So Robert has such a unique accent, and I met him in Indianapolis a couple of years ago at John Watson's first debate, and I didn't realize that he was listening to me, supporting me. I thought he's coming over to intimidate me with a futurist doctrine, but he wasn't, and so we became, we became very good friends. So 2 times his accent has come in very handy to talk about the Lord. So we were flying to Mexico a couple of weeks ago. The guy sitting next to me had a distinct accent. He's from Romania. And he was a civil engineer, and he came and he ran an expediting company. We talked about the coming of the Lord quite a bit. He talked, his accent was similar to yours. And then we were coming back from Pennsylvania, Gloria and I, and there was a fellow who'd walked in, and I nodded to him and said, "How are you doing today?" And he said, "I'm doing just fine. How's your day going?" I said, "Oh, there's another one." And he was another guy from Romania, and he comes through Southwest Michigan. I invited him to the services here. So the distinct Romanian accent of Robert Buna has opened the doors for the gospel for me. So anyways, I just wanted to share that with you. Anyways, it's time to go. We're thankful that you're here. I'm having a great time. I am. I'm having a wonderful time, and I don't have to worry about anything that's going to be said, because I know that when you put the framework of the book of Revelation together, it's kind of like putting a puzzle. Once you put the border together, you know that all the pieces go within that border. That's what all these speakers will do. And our next speaker is Brother John Holt from Los Angeles. Brother Holt is not a full-time gospel preacher, but he certainly is a gospel preacher. The first time I heard him deliver a lesson was in California with Brent at Springville. To tell you the truth, I thought it was the highlight of the lectureship. I was really appreciative of the work that Brother Holt has done. And John is a firefighter. Are you the chief or one of the chiefs of the, how's that go?
No, I'm a fire captain.
The fire, well, okay, you tell me the difference between a captain and a chief, okay? But he is a captain of the fire department of LA. He's a distinguished man, has a beautiful family. So John and Julie have begotten John and Julie, right? John Jr., just a beautiful family. And he converted his wife out of the Kajik. She used to attend with Magic Johnson and Denzel Washington, but she ended up liking John Holt better, and went with John Holt. And he just loves the truth. John loves the truth, and he is a great preacher. And I've just listened to him, and we began to talk, and I've just enjoyed getting to know him. And he came, we didn't have a lot of money to spread around. It's still sparse. We could try to get some, but these guys have agreed to come without any promise of remuneration. And John is one of those guys. John, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for coming. And you come preach from Revelation chapter 8. And tell us a little bit about exactly at what point you came to believe that Jesus returned in 70, because it wasn't that long ago.
No, it
Right.
isn't. Okay, well, as one of the other brothers said, Holger, you're way too kind, but I do appreciate the kind words. First, I'd like to thank you all for being here, for the invitation, for the congregation here. Thank you, Sister Julie, for offering your home up to us and taking care of us. We really do appreciate the hospitality that you and your husband have given us, so we're very thankful for that. My journey to understanding this truth came when I was in preaching school, just studying the scriptures. I had an opportunity to be in a preaching school. I was given the task of preaching a sermon series from Matthew chapter 5, and I was taking other classes, Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and I just began to put scriptures together. And after that, it was really a shocker to me that the things that I was taught and the things that I'm now seeing were not adding up with one another. So I began to ask questions. Those questions were not answered. And then I finished that semester and I began looking on the internet, and I reached out to Brother Steve. He got me in contact with Brother Bissell. And from then on, my journey has just taken off. My learning has increased, and I've just been very thankful for everything that the Lord has blessed me and given me, because without him, I definitely wouldn't have found the truth and had the conviction to stand for it. So very thankful for that. So today I'm going to talk about Revelations chapters 8 and 9. So we're going to skip 7. You're going to have the book, you're going to have the videos. We'll be able to go back and look at 7, but we're just going to transition to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is one of these transition chapters. It's a transition chapter of the one prophecy of Revelation. And if we look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 3 that was already pointed out, it says, "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written wherein it, for the time is near." It's one prophecy. So chapter 8 is going to begin with the 7th seal opening, and then we're going to start seeing that this prophecy is going to retell itself. It's much like reading the Gospels concerning the Transfiguration. You can read Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9, and you're going to see the same vision told from different perspectives by different writers with more and more information. And that's exactly what Revelation is, except there's one writer, and he's retelling this prophecy. So, in Revelation chapter 1, it says, "When he opened the 7th seal, there was a silence in heaven for about a half hour." We have to keep in mind, again, that it's one prophecy. The 7th seal gives way to the 7 trumpets, and the 7 trumpets give way to the 7 plagues. So when we have the 7th seal being opened, we essentially have the 7th trumpet being blown. So that begins the end of the judgment upon Jerusalem and the judging of all the nations. And that's exactly what we find in Joel chapter 3, verses 10 and following. You'll see that he judges not just Jerusalem, but he gathers all the nations and he judges those nations. So that 7th seal, that 7th trumpet, that 7th plague, that's when God, he would sustain his judgment. He would confirm his covenant with judgment. And that's how he goes about creating his people. We have that with Noah and the flood. We have that with Egypt, with Israel coming out of Egypt. And in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7, it says, "Of his increase and of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David over his kingdom, to order it, to establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." So that's how God goes about confirming his covenant. That's how he went about confirming the new covenant, was with judgment. That judgment that will come upon Jerusalem and subsequently upon all the nations. And we will continue to be judged by this covenant even today and forever. So in verse 2, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets." So this theme and this idea of the 7 trumpets, we can look back at Joshua chapter 6. And in Joshua chapter 6, we'll notice that only the priests there, when Joshua had brought the people, they were going to be given the land of Jericho, the city of Jericho. And in Joshua chapter 6, they were given instructions by the Lord that they would have to march around the city and that these priests would be given trumpets. And what the trumpet does, it is an announcement of something. If you look back in Numbers chapter 10, you'll see the making of the trumpets and the purpose of the trumpets. It would be to call the people, to gather the people, to make way for war, to announce something. So now in Joshua chapter 6, we find that the 7 priests were given 7 trumpets and that the ark of the covenant would follow. We find also that Joshua commands them not to utter a word out of their mouth while they were marching around this city. There was a silence there. They were not permitted to speak. And on the 7th day, they would march around the city 7 times. And on the 7th day, after marching around the city 7 times, they would blow the trumpets and they would let out a shout. So when we follow that theme to the book of Revelation, we see that same backdrop. We see that these trumpets are giving, It is making an announcement after the seals are being opened. The judgment is revealed. The trumpets announce the judgment that's going to take place. And then the city is given to Israel, just like the kingdom will be given to the Christians, and judgment would take place. In Revelation 8:3, then another angel having a golden cistern, he came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints and the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascend before God from the angel's hand. We find that right there in Revelation chapter 5, verse 8. This is parallel. This is the retelling of the same event. The 24 elders, they fall before the Lamb, each having a harp, golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. The incense here represent the prayers of the saints. They're in conjunction with the prayers of the saints. Now, if we were to look at the golden incense, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4, it tells us that that golden cistern was located in the most holy place. And if we go back to Leviticus chapter 11, Leviticus chapter 16 through 11, we find that these incense were used in the most holy place by the high priest during the atonement ritual. Now, he would go inside the veil, he would light the incense would cover the mercy seat, and then the atonement process will begin. And this atonement process would not be complete until the high priest would come out of the most holy place. And during that time, nobody was allowed inside the tabernacle of meeting while the high priest was performing his work. So when we look at that and we parallel that with Jesus as our high priest, we see that Jesus ascends into the heavens. He goes in behind the veil into the most holy place, and he performs his work. And no one is allowed into the most holy place. No one is allowed into heaven until he comes out. And just like the high priest in the Old Testament of Leviticus 16, he would have to come out and confess the sins and the iniquities of the people. And then they will receive the blessings, and then they will be able to come back into the holy place. Also, when we look at Revelation chapter 6, verse 9, Brother Gates talked about martyr vindication. We have these saints. They were promised vindication. They were praying for atonement. You can't have atonement without vindication. The ones who were living, the ones who were in Hades, that's what they were waiting for. And they were waiting for Christ to return, to come out and to finish that atonement process so that they could receive those blessings of going into heaven. In verse 5, we find the angel took the cistern, filled it with fire from the altar, and he threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, and lightnings, and earthquake. So the seventh angel had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Again, we have the retelling of the same event. Matthew chapter 24, verse 7. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famine, pestilence, earthquake in various places. And he says all of these are the beginning of sorrows. So we see earthquakes, we see noises, pestilence in various places. These are the beginnings of sorrows before the seven angels who had the seven trumpets will begin to sound. In verse 7, the first angel sounded, hail, fire followed, mingled with blood. They were thrown to the earth. A third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. This is indicative of a famine. This is all judgment. We find this same type of judgment taking place in Exodus chapter 9, verses 19 and following. When Moses went to the Pharaoh and he said, listen, you need to let the people go. And if you don't let these people go, this is what's going to happen. Every animal which is found in the field is going to be brought home. Is not brought home, they're going to die. We're going to have thunder, hail, fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Both man and beast, hail struck every herb of the field, broken every tree of the field. So here we have this idea of famine taking place where cattle, herbs, all the things of the land were destroyed. So this is the judgment that is now being brought upon the land. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great burning mountain with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. We find that same type of language used in Jeremiah chapter 51, 24, and 25, where the Lord would use the Medes to destroy the kingdom of Babylon. And he says, I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all the evil they've done in Zion. In your sight, says the Lord. Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, who destroys all the earth, says the Lord. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the rocks and make you a burning mountain. This is indicative of a nation being destroyed. So what is Revelation about? What city is it about? What have we talked about this so far through these first 6 chapters? It is the destruction of Jerusalem. That will be the great mountain that will be burning and thrown into the sea. In Mark chapter 11, verse 23, after Jesus curses the fig tree, which represents Israel, we can look at Hosea chapter 9 and 10 and Luke 13, 6. But he says, for surely I say unto you, whoever says to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believe those things and says they will be done, he would have whatever he says. So Jesus isn't talking about taking a physical mountain and throwing it into the water. He is talking about a kingdom that would be destroyed. And it was the Jewish earthly kingdom that would be destroyed. That would be the kingdom that was built with hands, that would be destroyed, and it would usher in the kingdom not made with hands that would live on forever. Now, we mentioned briefly about the sea. Now, we do have Isaiah chapter 60, verse 5, where it says, reference to the sea, then you shall see and become radiant, and all your house shall swell with joy, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to thee, and the wealth of the Gentiles shall come to you. We also have a reference to the sea in Daniel chapter 7, where it talks about, verses 2, where it talks about the 4 winds stirring up the great sea. And in verse 3, it talks about those great beasts coming from the sea. Now, these aren't literal animal beasts that are coming up out of the water. And when we look at verse 17 in chapter 7, it talks about those being 4 kings. Those 4 kings are of 4 nations. They are of the great sea. So we see in the Old Testament that they use the word sea to represent nations. Nations that are afar off, nations that are not of the land of Palestine, that are not Jewish nations. So in verse 10, and the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and of the spring of the rivers. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the waters, because it was made bitter. Now, we talked about this burning mountain. So now we have this star. So this star is correlated with this burning mountain. It has to be someone in authority. So when we look at passages such as Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, it says, "O you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer," which is literally the day star, the morning star, son of the morning, "how you are cut down to the ground, you who are weak in the nations." He's referring to Babylon here. He was called a star. So he was someone that was in authority, someone in a position of power, someone in a position of influence. So this mountain that would fall, being Jerusalem, this star is connected to that mountain. In my opinion, it's the high priest, someone who is in a position of authority. He would fall, burning like a torch, and he would be called wormwood. And if we look up that term wormwood, it means bitter. We have a few references here: Deuteronomy 29, verses 18, Jeremiah 19, 15, 23 and 15, and Amos 6 and 12. This word is only used about 7 or 8 times. I only just put a few of them up here. But anytime this word is used, it has to do with being disobedient to the Lord. He mentions in Jeremiah chapter 23 how the prophets would speak their own words and not speak the words of the Lord. And he would talk about they would be giving bitter water to drink. Those aren't the words of the Lord. He gives living waters, not bitter waters. So wormwood It has to be somebody, this star has to be somebody in position of authority who would go out and spew false prophecy, someone who would go out and prophesy on their own will and not speak on behalf of the Lord. Verse 12, and the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that the third were darkened, a third of the day did not shine, likewise the night. So it's pointed out already from Brother Gates when he was going through Revelation 6. We see that the sun, the moon, and the stars aren't the literal sun, the moon, and the stars. We have to use the Old Testament. Things were written before time were for our learning and our understanding. We can't understand the things in the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation, if we don't go back and reference those things in the Old Testament. That's where the language comes from. So whatever it meant in the Old Testament, it has to mean the same thing in the New Testament. We have to be consistent because the apostles, the writers of the New Testament, they were consistent. That's the only way they would be able to understand these things. If not, we can make every passage whatever we want it to be. So we have to be consistent. So in Isaiah 13, speaking of Babylon, for the stars of heaven and their constellation will not give their light. The sun will be darkened, its going forth, the moon will not cause its light to shine. In verse 13, therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. So we see how this is being used. We can also reference Genesis 37, 9 through 10. We can see the same thing in Revelation 12, 1 through 4, how Israel is depicted as the sun, the moon, and the stars. In verse 13, and I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the remaining blast of the trumpets of the three angels who are about to sound. So here we close out the chapter. We have three woes, three angels, three more trumpets. And we move into chapter 9. In chapter 9, verse 1, the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from the heaven of the earth, from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like a great smoke furnace, like a smoke of a great furnace, so that the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke, locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power as scorpions of the earth have power. When we look at this text, this is a reference to Joel chapter 1 and Joel chapter 2, and really the entire book of Joel. So we see how the locusts, they're going to come up. They're going to cause the sun and the air to be darkened, and it's going to create a darkness. Where there's darkness and there's smoke, there's destruction. And they're going to come up with the earth, and they're going to be given power as scorpions. Now, if you look at Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 6, you'll see where the Lord tells Ezekiel, don't be scared, go to the people of Israel. You've been among thorns and briars, and you lived among scorpions. He's not really talking about bushes and thorns and actual scorpions that will sting you, but he's talking about the people. And so now these locusts are going to have the same authority as the scorpions. These are the people of God. They're going to be able to carry out the things because God's going to use nations to implement his judgment. So this leader, this star that falls from heaven, he's given the keys to the bottomless pit where the smoke arises. This is someone in a position of authority. He's going to be the person who is in charge of these locusts. And in my opinion, again, I don't have a specific name, but it is a Roman leader. Because as you're going to see, they are the ones who would be these locusts that we're going to take a look at. So in Joel chapter 1, the word of the Lord came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders, give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days or even in the days of your fathers? He says, tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children and their children another generation. So this isn't something that they're looking forward to in their immediate generation. He says, has this happened in your day? Has it happened in your father's day? But listen, tell your children, have them tell their children and their children in another generation. And he goes on to talk about the chewing locusts, the swarming locusts, what they've eaten, the crawling locusts and the consuming locusts. And in verse 6, he says, for a nation has come against my land, strong without number, teeth as the teeth of a lion, and he has fangs of a fierce lion. And in verse 7, he has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it, bare it, thrown it away. Its branches are made white. Now, we've already seen how the fig tree is about Israel. There is going to be a nation that's going to come against his nation. They're going to be fierce. And they're going to destroy the people of Israel. They're going to destroy this land. So now look at this army in chapter 2 of Joel. He says, blow the mountain in Zion. Sound the alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. It was at hand as it pertains to the generation that was coming. Not at hand during their time, but to their children, their children's children, and to another generation. In that future generation, that's when it would be at hand. And he says, a darkness and a gloominess, a clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. People come great and strong, like whom has never been, nor will ever been since there was nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. This is the nation that will bring the time of trouble, as has never been or ever will be since there was a nation. This is Daniel chapter 12. This is Matthew 24, 15, and also 22. This is the Roman Empire. They would bring this army that would be fierce like no other and destroy this nation, this mountain that he would bring against them. And he says, a fire devours before them, and behind them a burns of flame. The land is like a garden of Eden before them, and behind them desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, like swift steeds, so they run. With a noise of chariots over mountains they leap, like the noise of a flaming fire that devoured the stubble, like the strong people set in battle array. There was only one nation that would do that. That was prophesied in Daniel chapter 7, that there would be no other nation like this. That nation is Rome. That's the fourth beast. So we find that God continues to use nations to destroy other nations. He uses nations to bring about his will in creating his people. And he would use them to destroy and bring judgment upon Jerusalem, therefore showing that judgment would be upon the world. And in chapter 9, verse 4, they were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their forehead. So we see right here in this text that the grass of the earth, the green thing, the tree, those locusts could not harm those, but only those men. So this is referring to, in this text, as men. Only the men who did not have the seal of God would be harmed. And they were given authority to kill them. They were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee for them. So we see that this authority is given to these locusts. They were not to harm any green thing, any tree, but only those men who did not have the seal of God. And this just is indicative of that time of trouble that would be like never before, nor will ever will be. These men would be suffering so much that they would want to die, but they wouldn't find death because they would be punished. In verse 7, and the shape of the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. So now we're being given the description of what these locusts are. He's saying they were shaped like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold. Their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. Again, we can look right back at Joel chapter 1, verse 6, and continue through that book and see this is talking about the same group of people. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots and many horses running in battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tail. Their power was to hurt man for 5 months. So this is exactly what we find in Joel. This is the same army, the same nation that will come against Jerusalem and destroy that fig tree. And John writes that they had hair like women. They had long hair. That's indicative. Paul said, by nature, man is ashamed to have long hair. That was indicative of Gentiles who had long hair. That he's talking about a Gentile nation that would come against them. In verse 11, and they had as a king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name is in Hebrew Abaddon, but in the Greek his name is Apollyon. Here you look these words up, it says it's Satan, it's the devil, the adversary, the same person, adversary, same Satan of Revelation 20. He was a king of the bottomless pit. That's where they would have their power and their authority would be given to them. They would be operating not of God, but of the adversary. In verse 12, one woe is past, behold, two more woes are coming after these. Then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 6, we find before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, in the midst of the horns and around the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes in the front and in the back. I believe that these 4 horns are those 4 living creatures. They're before the throne. They're around the throne, around the altar, which is around the throne. Verse 7, the first living creature was like a lion, and he goes on to describe these living creatures. But in verse 6, we can see the similarities there between verse 13 and Revelation 4 and 6. So in verse 14, saying the sixth angel who had the trumpet released the 4 angels who are bound to the great river of Euphrates. So we find the same thing. Again, Revelation is a retelling of the same event. We can look to Revelation chapter 16, verse 12, and the 6th angel poured out his bowl. So now he's executing what was being announced on the river Euphrates, and the waters dried up. So that way the kings from the east might be prepared. So we see here that the trumpet is sounded, the 4 angels are released. We find out what it does. It dries up the river. It allows those armies across in order to come in and bring that destruction. In verse 15, so the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour and the day, the month and year, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of these horsemen was 200 million. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, sulfur yellow, and the heads of the horses were like heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. When we look at that verse there, 200 million, literal number or not, I mean, that's a lot of people, 200 million. That's Joel chapter 2. Verse 2, a people come great and strong, like whom would never be. You can't have a time of trouble like never has been since there was a nation, nor never will be. You can't have that twice. Right. You can't have a strong and great people come whom has never been, nor will ever will be. You can't have that twice. That has to be the same people of Revelation chapter 9, verse 16. They have to be the same people. Otherwise, it's a contradiction in itself. So that's the same Roman army, the same 4th beast that would bring about that destruction. And a fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them desolate wilderness. Surely nothing should escape them. Nothing escaped them. Not one stone would be left unturned. Millions and millions of people died when the Roman army came and destroyed Jerusalem. verse 18. By these 3 plagues, a third of mankind was killed. So you notice they call them plagues, by fire, by smoke, and brimstone, which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents, and their heads with them they do harm. In Isaiah chapter 9, verses 14, therefore the Lord will cut off the head and the tail from Israel, palm branch and bulrush in one day. The elder and honorable, he is the head. The prophet who teaches lies, he is the tail. For the leaders of this people cause in the earth, and those who are led by them are destroyed. He's referring to people, people in authority, people in leadership, the heads, the tails, not actual heads and tails of beasts. The plagues that would come out of their mouths. In Revelation 12, we read that already about the Euphrates being dried up. And now we have unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophet. Again, this is a retelling of the same event, but more and more information now is being given. For they are the spirit of demon performing signs of going out to the kings of the earth, the whole earth, to gather them to battle of the great day of God Almighty. So these plagues, the fire, the smoke, this brimstone, in Revelation 16, it's called unclean spirits, spirits of demons. They're performing false signs and wonders, or performing signs which go out. So they're causing people to err, causing people to turn away from the truth, and now they're going to be destroyed as a result of that. They're going to be judged. Either they're going to be physically killed and also spiritually killed, or as we'll see here in the end of this chapter, not everybody dies. You know, we're going to see some people that continue to physically live but will be spiritually dead. And as we look at the last 2 verses, but the rest of mankind were not killed by these plagues. They did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and the idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which neither see nor hear or talk or walk. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorceries, or their sexual immoralities, or their thefts. And that's where we end Revelation 9. So I know I did not spend maybe a full hour, but hopefully we were able to get through the things, and I was able to hit the highlights without taking too much of your time. But hopefully you got something from that, and I do appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Give them that mic.
Just put this on just for a moment. Thank you, John. Thank you for the thorough job. John did a very thorough job in Springfield. I'm impressed the way that he puts the verses together. And this actually has been a bit consternation for me, Revelation chapter 8 and 9. Now, I'm going to agree that that fourth world empire, that has to be Rome. And that has to be ultimately the Roman authorities that are coming to destroy the nation. But there was a time in the Great Tribulation period where the Roman armies came through, Cestus Gallus retreated. Now when he retreated, it gave time for the Jews, Jewish Christians, to get out of Jerusalem. During that time, there's a group of zealots that then backed up and went through Palestine and found that everyone who had given in to Rome, they killed. They made a point. I'm just going to give you another understanding or my opinion about they had hair like women's hair. I don't believe that that was Gentiles. As a matter of fact, I believe that the Gentiles had very short hair. When Paul says to Corinth in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 14, it's a shame for a man to have long hair. Doesn't even nature itself teach you that it's shame for a man to have long hair. He was speaking about a Gentile background, I believe, with Jewish practices. So the Jews could have this voluntary Nazirite vow in which they grew their hair, which, interesting enough, Paul in Acts 18:18, he cuts, I don't believe his own hair, but he cuts Aquila's hair. And I think what he is doing is to say that don't take a voluntary Jewish vow in a Gentile land, because doth not even nature, that is long-standing habit, teach you it's a shame for the man have long hair. I don't think that can be intrinsic nature, because God allowed the Jews to grow their hair long on period of times. It's known that they had long beards and long hair. In my estimation, what's going on is during that transition period, as Rome came down, that they would be the ultimate power of authority to punish the land. That there was actually a time for the zealots to go back and find anyone that had given in to Rome would be punished. Now, Josephus records a group of wretches that were the worst of the worst. And these men plundered the Jewish communities, and anyone that gave into Rome, and they all had to give into Rome to live, they plundered their goods. One thing that they did in their ways, they abused both men and women. They were effeminate in their ways, and Josephus records how they pranced upon individuals during this time. Josephus, the Jewish historian, recorded how they would come as friends, walking like women, and then they would pounce and rape the men and then kill them. And then went, and you talk about a time of trouble, such as was never since the nation to that same time, and they only had their authority until the Romans came back and killed all of them as they went back. Go ahead, Brent, you go ahead and you might want to say something.
They were called the Sicarii.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
They were Edomites, and they had come up from Edom. They had gotten their way into the city. They took over the priesthood, according to Josephus.
Okay.
They killed all the priests, and they set in their own high priest, Phinehas ben Samuel. They set him in, and that was the man of sin, from AD 68 to AD 70. He was the man of sin the very day Rome breached through the walls and killed him and destroyed that temple.
Okay.
So it was the Sicarii.
The
faction. That's the actual.
Thank you very much for the. Thank you very much for the information. It is an interesting history. So remember, there are stages. So that's the fifth angel, and it appears to me that ultimately it's Roman. I'm going to agree with you there. It has to be at the end, but it looks like to me in the midst that we have that Jew upon Jew, because he says the star fell from heaven. So it looks like that there is some kind of authority that they're coming down from in the very same kind of language of Revelation chapter 8. But this is one of those things we can banter back and forward a little bit and debate in a friendly way. But I know one thing. It has ultimate reference to the judgment of the land of Palestine. And it is just an intriguing study. So thank you. By the way, I enjoyed this 7 trumpets and the comparison to Jericho. That was excellent. What I have found with Brother John Holt is that he is thorough. He goes and he begins to compare Scripture with Scripture, and he's beginning to, he puts things together and wants to make it fit within that framework, which he did very, very well. So there are some nuances here, and we're going to be honest with each other. When you disagree with my lesson am I preaching tomorrow? Yeah, tomorrow, yeah. Somebody disagrees with any point, have at it. I don't mind at all. I stand corrected. We don't mind debating here. If you think we do, you can listen to a telephone conversation between me and Steve Baisden sometime.